Hello, today's date is November 21st, 2017. My name is Courtney Klapman, and I'm a graduate student in the Salem State University's history program. I have the great pleasure of being joined today by Margo Burns, who's the descendant of Rebecca Nurse. We are here today as part of the Salem Witch Trials Descendant Oral History Project. So thank you for driving down from New Hampshire.
Oh, my pleasure.
So tell me about life growing up in New Hampshire.
Well, we didn't know much about the witches then. My grandmother was very interested in genealogy, so we knew all about our Mayflower ancestors. And it was constantly, that was the thing. My brother is actually named after one of our Mayflower ancestors.
Okay.
So, I don't know, that she was very proud of it, even though we're like seventh generation New Hampshire family.
So you guys have been there for a while?
Yeah,
Awesome.
Go way back to Whitefield, New Hampshire, and Dalton, New Hampshire.
Where is that close to Portsmouth?
Almost in Littleton,
Oh, okay.
so up in the White Mountains.
So you were born in Hanover, but went to high school in Manchester. So where exactly did you grow up?
My parents are both from Hanover.
Oh,
Both
okay.
high school sweethearts at Hanover High. She was the head cheerleader. He was a year ahead of her as the all-star varsity athlete and head of the student council, that kind of thing. But he went off to the Navy after Dartmouth, and they got married right out of college.
Oh, wow.
And he then went to Tufts for a master's degree in education, and the first job was in Northeast Kingdom of Vermont.
Wow.
Little teeny high school in Island Pond, Vermont. And from there we moved to Falmouth, Massachusetts, and then back up to the Northeast Kingdom. And finally, when I was about 10 years old, he got a job at Manchester Central High School in Manchester, New Hampshire, and stayed there for 26 years until he retired.
Wow.
So that's how I ended up in Manchester, and proud graduate of Manchester Memorial High School.
So how would your parents describe you as a child?
I don't know, probably just very inquisitive, always into things, and a reader.
Avid reader.
Yeah. I was the first grandchild on my mother's side of the family, so I got a lot of attention from my grandparents.
So you mentioned what your dad did for a living, but what did your mom do?
She was an artist early on, did a lot of pottery, silk screening, and then she started a company dealing with New England antiquities. That was the name of the company. And we spent a lot of time growing up going to flea markets, setting up at antique shows and things like that. And her specialty was early American pressed glass. They're out of the business now, they're still very much alive, but early American pressed glass from Sandwich, Massachusetts, and some things from Portland, Maine.
Do you have some of her?
Oh, they're still very much alive, and it's still all in the house. And it's given me I have appreciation for it. I don't think the market is very good for it now, but if you see some of the stuff, it's beautiful, absolutely beautiful. I think it's really hard to pass down antiques these days because a lot of millennials really don't care, I don't think.
That's an
But
interesting
I'm probably
point.
going to inherit a bunch of these things, and I'm just going, where am I going to put it? I hope I inherit the display cases too.
That would be paired up nicely. So you mentioned that you had a brother. Do you just have that one brother? Do you have
Yeah.
other siblings?
My brother's 5 years younger than I am, and he's the town manager in York, Maine.
Nice. Were you guys very close growing up?
Yeah, I used to hit him a lot until puberty, and then he pinned me down on the ground and said, "This is going to stop it." So we're fairly close these days, but he lives an hour away, and he and his wife are very busy. But every holiday we all get together.
Nice.
It's kind of predictable, though.
What was your experience like at Manchester High School? It seems from when you mentioned it before, you had a good experience there.
Yes, I did very well, so it wasn't necessarily a challenge. I think my favorite project in high school, I still know where absolutely every piece of it is, and this is going to sound very strange, but I had a really good American history teacher junior year. His name was Ed Valade, and every year everybody knew there was a project of find out what happened the week you were born. And people would have to go to the library and look at microfilm, because this would have been in 1973, 74. And I already knew what happened, the big story, the week I was born. Sputnik went up. So, and I was the kind of kid that I could write a paper at the last minute and get an A. So, but 2 weeks before, I'd been taking a lot of photographs. I'd just gotten an enlarger for a Christmas present, and I was had my own dark room, and I started taking a lot of photographs. And I had some of them at school, and he came over to me at one point because I'm doing all these pictures and showing my friends, because I was a geek. I really was a geek. And he came over, it was 2 weeks before the project was due, and he said, well, I don't know how far along you are in your research on the paper. And I went, Sputnik went up the week I was born. And he said, well, would you like to change it and take more pictures and give a class presentation? And I just took to it like a duck to water. And I started taking so many more photographs of Manchester, and I even got myself onto the top of the tallest building. It was the Hampshire Plaza building, and I convinced the people who ran it to let me go up there with a security guard, and I took panoramic pictures of all 4 directions, printed them all out, gave this presentation that surprised me that I nailed it exactly for the time. And then he asked me to do it to his other class. And it was really the first time I'd done any kind of presentation and that I'd looked at something really deeply. Manchester's a wonderful town. It has a great history with the mill yards. There are a couple of Frank Lloyd Wright houses. And I really had a lot of good times doing all that research in those 2 weeks. And I am grateful to him because I know where all those photographs are. I know where all the negatives are. And it's the only piece from high school that I've really held on to. So I think that might have cemented my interest in finding out everything I could about a subject.
And it seems like he had a very lasting impression on you
Yes.
as well.
Yep.
Did you ever experience or witness any social injustice through your public school career?
Well, we did have some school walkouts. Of course, as I think about it, I'm going, what would that have been about? Oh, probably smoking or something like that, because that was the early 70s, and we were very indignant about anything that would happen to us because, of course, the world revolved around us. Mm-hmm. We were just a little younger than the generation that was protesting the Vietnam War, so we didn't think that our classmates would be drafted and sent to war. I'm trying to think. I think that was the big thing, and we were much younger when we were hearing about it. Right. And the protests. For northern Vermont, we still had a family house up near the Canadian border, and there was Earth People's Park. We heard about that. A bunch of hippies right there. And it was years later before somebody said, well, you know why that commune was right on the Canadian border, don't you? And I said, because they were taking young guys and getting them across the border into Canada. You know, here's this wild hippie commune, but it was right on the Canadian border in Norton, Vermont. And it was like, oh yeah. Because I was just young enough that I didn't necessarily know all those details or think about my peers having to run away from the draft. So basically for us, it was the hippies.
So why Mount Holyoke? Why attend college there?
In the summer between junior and senior year in high school, they have a program at St. Paul's School in Concord, New Hampshire called the Advanced Studies Program. Mm-hmm. And I was already very interested in languages. I'd studied French and Spanish, and they had a program where you could study just about anything for 6 weeks. And they took the top students in the state. I wanted to take Russian, but only one other person wanted to take Russian, so they said, how about German? So I took German, and for 6 weeks, we had the equivalent of 2 years of high school German.
Wow.
Yeah, and there were a lot of us in the class. There were 8 girls, we were girls then, and 3 boys. And 3 boys didn't really connect much, but the 8 of us really bonded. And the intern for the class had just graduated from Mount Holyoke. As a matter of fact, of the 8 of us, 3 of us ended attending Mount Holyoke.
Wow.
One at Smith, one at Dartmouth, it was just sort of like, but 3 of us in that class. So I think we were heavily influenced by the intern saying, Mount Holyoke, and it looks like St. Paul's, and you'll love it. So.
And you also continue your education. So you went to UNH for 2 master's degrees and then did some coursework at USC. Was that some of the animation cartoon training that you had?
Nope. My first master's was in fiction writing. Basically, I tell people I got a master's degree in making things up. And then my first job after that was teaching English as a second language to adults in Manchester. And then after I'd been doing that for a year, I realized I really didn't know what I was doing. So I returned to UNH to get a master's in teaching, but I didn't like the education department very well because I'd already been in the English department, and I loved the English department. And my friend said, come over, come back, get a master's in linguistics. And I loved it. It was the perfect choice for me. And after that, I wanted to get a doctorate, but UNH doesn't have anything beyond a master's in linguistics. So that's how I ended up going out to USC. I entered a program that was, they were in the process of dividing it. There are two sort of tracks in linguistics. One is theoretical, the stuff with Chomsky, and just everything is kind of mathematical and things like that. And then there's applied linguistics, and that was for teaching languages and how do people acquire a second language? How does language change over time, connecting with other languages? There are a lot of aspects to linguistics, and I'd gone there because I wanted to continue applied, and they had a great program, and they had people I liked. What I didn't know was that they were in the process of eliminating that particular track. The way USC was working on cutting out faculty was not cutting programs, but by waiting for people to leave. And therefore, they'd lost a couple of people in applied linguistics, and they had to make a decision as to whether they would continue that. And so I was there the last year, and the rest of the applied linguists were just saying, you're not going to get us more graduate students to work with, we're leaving. So there I was kind of stuck. I had a fellowship, so I stayed for the 2 years of the fellowship. I discovered I really did not like applied. Didn't like theoretical. And there were a lot of theoretical linguists there. Most of them had trained at MIT, and I ended up taking a few seminars and things I liked, and I found that I really liked historical linguistics, which was really, I hadn't known much about it. I'd taken a history of English from at UNH by Rochelle Lieber, and I'd like that, but it was just kind of funky. You find out why there are two words for things like you have cow and beef, and why you have the different vocabulary and the connection with other languages. And I really thought that was cool. But I ended up doing this program about, it was a whole seminar, and he was interested in legal language. Get this, legal language in the second half of the 17th century in America. He was putting together a corpus of language, and this is the particular register he was on then, legal language. He'd already done things like letters and diaries and medical journals and things like that. There were all these different kinds of writing, and that's what he was interested in. And by chance, that was where I ended up, and that's where I was introduced to the legal records of the witchcraft trials. Okay. Other people were doing infanticide, pirates, arson, rape, things like that, these capital cases. But when he picked up the one and said, oh, and I got the Salem witchcraft trials, I don't know, there's a whole lot here. and I said, I'll take that, because I have an ancestor who was executed then. And that was the first time I really actively sought out anything about the Salem witchcraft trials and that part of my ancestry.
So I guess bringing up the witch trials is a good segue. So describe to me the moment and setting you're in when you found out you were Rebecca Nurse's 10th great-granddaughter.
My first job teaching, I was teaching photography, because everybody knew me as a photographer from high school, and there was somebody who was out on sabbatical, and I started teaching photography. And one day, one of my students came in saying that he was cast as Francis Nurse in the school's play of The Crucible. And I just received a whole bunch of stuff. My dad had given me his mother's genealogy research, and I'd been going through some of that, and I said, I think that's a name in my family, Francis Nurse. And I went home and I dug through my grandmother's things, and there on the page of the Nurse family, with this little asterisk down at the bottom of the page, said, Rebecca Nurse hanged for witchcraft in Salem, 19th July, 1692. And I went, oh, I guess they were real. And that was the moment that I learned about it. And I'd always heard about the Mayflower ancestors. I'd never heard about that. So
Whole new experience.
Oh, it was kind of, okay, that's different. But I think anytime you get interested in something, there are a whole lot of hooks. You've got to get touched a few times before something latches. And it didn't really latch until graduate school and doing that research with Ed Finnegan at USC.
Okay. Was the family tree that your grandmother had, was that in good condition when you looked at it?
Oh, she documented everything. So I had the direct line right back. which was kind of cool. I didn't have to do the research.
Right.
But my grandmother had passed away several years earlier, so I couldn't talk to her about it. But I'd never heard about it within my family, even though clearly my grandmother knew about it. And she was really into Mayflower Society, DAR, all these early things, but she didn't talk about that one.
Why do you think that is?
Well, at one point, my uncle's family, my dad's older brother, they lived in Andover. And when I started into this, he was kind of like, oh, well, we don't want to talk about that. Okay. I thought it was interesting, but he clearly knew about it, but he really didn't want to spend any time doing it. I'm sure still. Mayflower. Mayflower was everything.
So introducing a new path of your...
Well, it's a different narrative.
Right.
It's definitely a different narrative. I mean, Mayflower, if I had been a boy, my father said my name would have been Bradford, after William Bradford. As a matter of fact, one of my cousins has a son, and he named him Bradford. And my brother is Stephen Hopkins Burns. So I recently got him into the Mayflower Society on that Hopkins line so that he has a nice certificate that he can put in his office that Stephen Hopkins Burns is a direct descendant of Stephen Hopkins who came over on the Mayflower.
So Mayflower history is very important to your family.
Oh, yes. On my dad's side of the family, especially.
So what did you feel when you found out you were related to Rebecca Nurse?
Well, it was mostly curiosity. I didn't look into it too much. I was just starting to be interested in genealogy, and when you start doing that and you inherit a whole bunch of information, it was kind of overwhelming. She'd done so much work, and I don't know how she did that all. Today you can get an account at Ancestry.com,
Yep.
and if you know a few names, I know 5 generations of my family by name off the top of my head. And I just went into Ancestry to see what would happen, and I started putting in, this is their parents. It didn't take too long before it was coming up with primary sources that I'd never heard of. And one of the things it came up with was my mother's father's passport application. A photograph of it has a picture of him. It was a facsimile of it. I'm going, how did they get it? And when I was doing some things for the Mayflower Society in recent years, I said, oh, my grandmother died in Virginia. I'm going to have to write down the... I checked on Ancestry. There it was. So these days, if you want to do some genealogy, Ancestry comes up with incredible primary sources. So I don't know what my grandmother was looking at to put together all that stuff that she did. So everybody in the family knew she was the one who was very involved in it, and there was so much. And that was just my dad's side of the family. And there was just so much that went back to 17th century America. She hadn't really gone over the pond at that point, but there was just so much, it was kind of overwhelming.
What about your mom's side of the family? Were they...
My mom's dad was from Connecticut, going way back to the 17th century, and her mother was from California, and most of her ancestors had come over, I don't know, from Scotland and England in the early part of, maybe the middle of the 19th century. So,
okay.
And then, she met my grandfather on a trip to Hawaii.
How romantic.
Yes, very much so.
How is your view on social justice informed by your direct relationship with Rebecca Nurse?
Oh, I definitely have a stand on the death penalty. A lot of people, we recently, just this week, Charles Manson finally died a natural death at age 83 in prison. And if anybody, you want to talk about who deserves the death penalty, he's probably somebody that most people would have agreed should have been executed. And I can't agree. I just can't. Just knowing that there were, my own ancestor was executed wrongly for a crime that didn't really happen.
Right.
What crime was there? There were accusations, but they say, the Salem witches. There weren't any witches. There were people who were falsely accused. And then, within a year or so, there's Samuel Sewall in 1695 making his apology in his church in Boston. And I'm thinking, just a couple years later, they realized they did something wrong, and it still happens. So I am definitely opposed to the death penalty because you never know what's going to happen. And I'm happy that I live in a world without Charles Manson, but I'm much happier that he died. Old man, always lived most of his life in prison.
So even if somebody is guilty as Charles Manson with the crimes that he's committed, no death penalty?
No. No. And I also think it was a little weird on Jeffrey Dahmer. That's another person that most people would have said deserved the death penalty. I'm sorry, killing people and eating them. That was one of the grossest stories and vile. He got killed by the other prisoners. And sometimes I wonder if they just sort of set him up to be in a place like that so that the government wasn't executing him. They figured that other people would do him in prison. So he's another person. I wanted him to live his entire life and die an old man completely in custody, because there are enough other people who are accused falsely. The Innocence Project they stopped counting after 200, but they've been able to free lots of people based on DNA evidence that they hadn't done the crime. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really important, because 3 years after the Salem witchcraft trials, people were apologizing. They were having fasts and it doesn't take that long to figure out you've done something wrong. But you can't go back. You can't go back from it. So it has strongly informed my position on capital punishment.
What interests you most about your family lineage and the lessons of the trials? You seem to have a lot of enthusiasm.
Well, since that graduate course,
Mm-hmm.
Basically after that, I thought I would write something for my family. I left USC and came back to New England, and I was working at a school, actually St. Paul's School, where I'd done that summer program. Mm-hmm. I was at the winter school now, and I had my summers off. And I said, maybe I'll write something for my family about Rebecca Nurse. Let me do a little research. Well, I've already said I don't go halfway on anything. And I started reading and reading and reading. And that was maybe in the summer of '95 that I decided to start doing that. And it's now the fall of 2017. I still haven't written anything for my family. But it did get me interested in the primary sources. And then I was asked to join the staff for the Records of the Salem Witch Hunt by Bernie Rosenthal. What was the beginning question on that?
What most interests you about your family lineage and the lessons of the trials?
I think just seeing the story of somebody who is absolutely not guilty. Mm-hmm. She was, well, you have to count, because there were 153 people who were formally accused, the first 3 in the parsonage, and then you go to Martha Corey, so that's 4, and on the same day that Rebecca Nurse was accused, Dorothy Good, Sarah Good's daughter, was accused. So she was either the 4th or the 5th person accused, and from everything I can tell, she was a good Puritan person. She was a covenanted member of her church, mm-hmm. of the church in Salem town, not even Salem Village, as right. Martha Corey. And these people were accusing her of being in league with the devil, and the local magistrates found it credible enough to arrest her and put her in jail. I think just the whole idea of a community turning on its own is just absolutely mind-boggling. And I think it gets to a primary fear we have, mm-hmm. that the people we trust could turn on us. Mm-hmm. And here's somebody, what made her a target? What made this whole community go after her? And I thought that was just mind-boggling. I was reading all these stories about her. It sounded like she was an interesting person. I like the story of the hogs from the neighbors getting into their fields. And
I'm not familiar with that story.
Okay. Well, the neighbors, and this came out during all the proceedings, that several years earlier, the swine from one of the neighboring farms got into their crops. And I learned this later, that there were swine laws at the time. And different towns would walk the fences, because if your cows or somebody got into somebody else's cornfield, say, and destroyed it or started eating it, mm-hmm. you who owned the cows would be responsible for the damage. And the one exception was swine, because pigs and hogs they root around, they make a mess, and if you had pigs and swine, you had to control them. So, wait a minute, I did it in the wrong way. if the cows got in and your fence wasn't, I got to go back. If the cows got into your field, your fence wasn't secure enough, and they had walked the fences. You need to have them be good enough to keep other things out. So if the neighbor's cows got in, your fence wasn't strong enough, and you were responsible for your own damage.
Right.
But if the pigs got in, the person who owned the pigs was responsible. They
I
were
see what you're
supposed to
saying.
keep them penned and yoked and away from other people's things, because they could get through just about anything. And when they get big, they're very large, and they will just root everything up. So here the pigs from the family next door were getting into the nurse's fields. So it already violated the swine laws. And so there's an account by the wife in this family where a Rebecca nurse came out and was yelling, well, they always say railing at them, and she's calling to her son Benjamin, get the gun, because she wanted him to shoot these swine that had gotten into their fields, and she was completely justified in that. Mm-hmm. Well, this testimony by the wife also said that, well, their pigs were yoked, and the fences were broken, so she was trying to justify that was okay, that the nurses couldn't shoot their pigs. But fairly soon after this event, the husband apparently just got struck down blind and was in very sad shape medically, and was never the same, and finally died. Mm-hmm. So the interpretation of that was that Rebecca Nurse was so angry with them that somehow she had afflicted him and killed him, because that was one of the things that witches could do. They could get the devil's power, and they could kill people. So here she is all these years later, accusing Rebecca Nurse of killing her husband because their pigs had gotten into the nurse's farm.
And she was acting according to the laws.
Yeah, they could have killed all those pigs, or even one pig. But of course, here's the widow saying, well, our pigs were yoked, and her fence was a problem, and so that was evidence being brought up against her. And I think she sounds very forceful and understandable under the circumstances, but clearly she pissed off the neighbors. And when the husband died, how come he died?
So how have these lessons shaped you into who you are today?
Well, as I said, starting in 1995, when I started reading this, I became very fascinated with how people believe what they believe. Mm-hmm. How do we know what we know? As I said, my first introduction was really the Crucible, as it is for many people. Mm-hmm. And over the years, I've come to think of it. The Crucible is a story about marital infidelity, yep, with this thin veneer of the Salem witchcraft trials put on top of it, generated from context of McCarthyism. But I got really interested in the people. And when you first start doing this, there's so many people. Mm-hmm. Even some of the people that were hanged, most people don't know anything about them. And I just really get into everything. And that started shaping everything I did. I was married at the time when we started doing the book, and putting it together took 12 of us 10 years. This was Records of the Salem Witch Hunt, where we went through all the primary sources, which I just ate up. I mean, in that historical linguistics seminar, we were looking very carefully at the language and all these different things. And when I met Bernard Rosenthal, and he brought me into this, I tell you, the thing that hooked me there was when he showed me a facsimile of one of the manuscripts, and I was going, oh, if you could see the handwriting, you could find out who it was. So I was really attracted to all the personalities, even though it was over 300 years earlier. I started getting interested in right after the tercentenary. What's the word?
Tercentenary.
Tercentenary.
We'll get it.
Too many vowels and consonants in that. I don't know. So I missed it. Mm-hmm. I just missed it by a couple of years. But I get into things full force. And when Bernie invited me and he showed me that first facsimile, I was hooked, because I want to know how we know what we know.
Right.
And I just kept digging. As a matter of fact, over the years, I knew so much about Rebecca Nurse, I wanted to know about the rest of the people. So some of my interest in her sort of fell by the wayside until other things, then I keep going back to her and saying, wait a minute, what happened to her? And I really like following the exact thread of each person's case. And it shaped my life. I was married while we were doing most of this book, and in my household it became referred to as the damn book, because every vacation, every time I wasn't at my day job at St. Paul's, I was constantly working on this. So the day that it came out, and Cambridge University Press shipped me a copy, and I opened it up and I looked at it. It's the size of a ream of paper with hardcovers. And everybody said, "Oh, that's huge." And I went, "This is all it is." There were 12 of us. It took us 10 years. Is this all it is? But it was over. And at that point I said, you can't call it the damn book anymore. You just can't. Right. Because it's not taking up all my time. It's done. But it really did it. Doing all that work for those 10 years, working with all those people, traveling to Finland and Sweden, and doing these things with some of the most amazing linguists. As a matter of fact, 6 of the people on this project were linguists from Scandinavia, and historical linguists doing corpora, which is what Ed Finnegan at USC had been doing. They all knew him. He knew all of them. I'd read some of their stuff, as it turned out. So I get to work with these world-class linguists, even though I dropped out of my doctoral program. And then working with Bernie and getting to know so many people who were just the top people in the subject, that just took me right in. And I was with my people.
You're with your village.
Yes, you find your own people, and I definitely did, and that took over a great deal of my life.
So your personal relationship with the trials, it seems from the enthusiasm that you're giving me, it really added to the research that you conducted with Bernard Rosenthal.
Yeah, and the book came out in 2009, and here we are 8 years later, and I keep giving talks, public talks, ending up on TV from time to time, and it's really become my vocation. I love my job working at a school. I do technology support for the language department. Again, languages. Remember, I'd taken Spanish, French, and then German at St. Paul, and then gone into linguistics. So it's an absolutely wonderful job. But when I look at my passion, when I look at what I will do once I retire, I'll have more time to do this.
So over time, has your relationship, your personal relationship and professional relationship with the trials, has that changed your research method of the way you look at the evidence in the documents?
I think I'll always look at primary sources. As I said a couple of times, I want to know how we know what we know.
Right.
And there's so many misconceptions. One of the misconceptions that I really object to in The Crucible is the portrayal of Rebecca Nurse as this frail little woman, she's a saint, and she just sort of comes into the scenes as just this sweet little thing. Well, I read that document about her, railing at the neighbors and, "Benjamin, get the gun." And I'm going, this isn't some sweet, retiring little frail lady. I think that comes from the descriptions of her learning about being accused when she was in bed. She'd been sick for about a week, and she's told about this, and she's dumbfounded. So I see her in a very different light. I don't see her as this sweet, elderly lady who is sick and infirm. I see her as a much more dynamic, incredible person. And this thing happened to her, and every single thing that we see in her case, she was constantly objecting to, how she was searched for witches' teats, for one thing. One of the documents that really sort of cemented my interest in her. I was at a women's bookstore in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I think it doesn't exist anymore. And I'd already learned about this at USC, and I was looking at the bottom of this thing on American history, and there on the bottom was this book. It had a gold cover, and I pulled it out, I flipped it open, and there was a description of Rebecca Nurse's, genitalia. Because when they were searching for witches' teats, apparently when Satan made a witch, gave them a familiar. Now we know about black cats, of course, but it could be anything. It could be a little yellow bird. It could be a snake. It could be a turtle. You name it, a monkey, something, and it would nurse from a teat somewhere on the witch's body. So, you're thinking about these people from the UK, well, now we call it UK, from the British Isles. They probably pretty fair-skinned and had a lot of moles and warts and scars and pimples and blue spot, anything. So they would search them. Once you were accused, they were searching for evidence. And they'd have a panel of men searching men's bodies, and they would have a jury of women searching women's bodies. And this was a description of how they searched her body. And apparently they were finding a witch's teat somewhere in her genitalia. And there was a dry flap of skin. I mean, it was just, I went, why am I learning about my ancestors' private parts?
Right.
What is this? And one of the reasons I think she was very commanding is she said, you can't have this as evidence against me, because there were no midwives on that jury of women searching me. They didn't know what they were looking at. If you had a few good midwives, they would recognize that what the results were from my travails, giving birth. So chances are pretty good she had tearing, scarring, maybe a prolapsed uterus, something. But she went back to say, no, I don't accept the jury of women's findings that there's any kind of witch's teeth there. So I found her very proactive, and her family was very proactive. And I like that about her.
So what does all of this mean for you? What does all this work mean for you? What type of legacy are you trying to leave behind? Because even you mentioned after you're retired, you're like, oh boy, I get to do more. So what type of legacy are you trying to leave behind?
I want people to understand who these individuals were. It's very interesting to me, and I know we're talking about the Town family. It's interesting to me to look at Rebecca and her two sisters. I want people to understand what really happened to these people. It's a little overwhelming to think there were 153 people who were formally accused, and how do you tease that out? How do these people become real human beings and have real stories? I think it's really easy to just sort of generalize. One time I was looking for a timeline. I looked online to see, anybody have a timeline of the Salem witchcraft trial so I don't have to make one? Well, I clearly had to make one. I found one that was very particular in the first few days, in the first month, and it would name exactly when people were arrested and interrogated and sent to jail. And then in the following months, well, they might have a list of the people who were brought up for trial. And then by the end, it just sort of faded off into total nonsense. Well, and then in the fall, everybody decided they'd made a mistake, and, they freed everybody and they went home. And that's not what happened. And I think it's really hard to hold 153 stories in your head. Right. One of the things that comes up occasionally, I hear that you can hold 5 to 7 things in your head at a time. And then after that, it becomes a blur. So the first accusations are pretty easy. You've got you're in the parsonage, and Betty Paris, the daughter of Reverend Paris, who's 8 years old, and then you have 9-year-old Abigail Williams. And they're the ones that first had afflictions, supposedly. So let's see, because that's one slot of the 5, the 2 little girls. Then you have to have the people that they accused. Well, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, well, we can put the Sarahs together in another little slot because most people can't tell them apart because, there's two marginal women, maybe the usual suspects. And then you got Tituba, who's marked for class and race as an Indian slave. So you got 3 of your slots right there. Then the 4th slot, you've got Reverend Paris. And you got a double bonus on him because he's the minister and he's the father and uncle of the 2 little girls. So, okay, you got 4. Then you need a judge. Well, the local magistrates are John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin, so they're both named John. Okay, so you've got one. You've got 5 things there. The girls, the usual suspects they accused, Tituba, the father minister, and the judge. And with that, you can tell the whole story of a witchcraft trial. But notice there are only 3 people that are accused. You want to go right after that, you get Martha Corey. People don't know who she is. Maybe they've heard of Rebecca Nurse, but those are just within the first 6 accusations, but your brain's already full. If you want to go to 7 slots, then maybe you've heard of Giles Corey because he was pressed to death, and you know it because it's gruesome and perplexing. And you might know a name of somebody else, like Rebecca Nurse. Maybe if you have an ancestor, you know that other one. Oh, Susanna North Martin, a lot of people are descended from her. And they sort of know that story, or they may have heard about George Burroughs, who was a minister who was hauled back from Maine. And they might have heard of the Proctors because they'd seen the Crucible. But it's sort of a little frayed going from 5 to 7. After that, people don't know any of the stories. And I really want to make sure people know the stories of these people. And when we look at Mary Estey and Sarah Cloyce, it's very interesting because even though they may know the story of Rebecca Nurse being, a saintly woman and still accused and convicted and hanged, then they start talking about, but Sarah Cloyce escaped that. I'm going, well, do you know why she escaped that fate? Well, that was the point where the governor just let everybody go. No, that's not what happened. The story of Sarah Cloyce is really very interesting. And they tried to indict her in the fall of 1692. And in most people, they were indicting them for afflicting the regular girls, the Abigail Williams and Mary Warren and who else? Elizabeth Hubbard and Mercy Lewis and that crew. One of the indictments they were trying to get Sarah Cloyce on was for afflicting her own niece. Who knew? So in the fall, there they are trying to indict her on 3 charges, including one of her own nieces. And her sister-in-law, who was widowed at the time, wouldn't come in because he was being summoned. And that's an official summons. And she sends this apology that, they're just too sick and they can't come in and they're really sorry they can't come in. And the daughter, who's supposedly afflicted, no, we're just too sick, we can't come in. So the grand jury probably couldn't meet on these charges because they didn't have all of the witnesses that were summoned. So her grand jury got put off until January of 1693. And at that point, a lot of people weren't showing up for summonses. And at that point, all 3 of the indictments against her were marked ignoramus. The grand jury would look at a bill of indictment, and if they thought it was valid or something they could try, it would say bila vera. But if they said, we don't know, they would write the word ignoramus on the back of it. I love, sort of like, ignoramus, okay. So she was never indicted. And if it came up that you weren't indicted, then you were released upon paying your fees. So that's how she got out. Mm-hmm. And it was a very unusual charge to begin with, but her family clearly supported her and weren't going to be any part of her trials. And then, of course, the story is that she and her husband moved to Salem's End, Framingham. The house that's there that's just being preserved, it's been a wreck for a long time. It probably isn't the house they built. The stories are that they lived in caves until they built their house. But the house that's being conserved, I don't know, it's been a long story on that, is probably not the actual house they built, mm-hmm. but one that came along after it. But it's always known as the Clay's house. They even changed the spelling of the name just to get away from it. So I like her story a whole lot, and saw that the whole family gathered around all 3 of the sisters. Didn't quite save 2 of them, but Sarah Cloyce, they did.
But the support was there.
The support was there. I mean, her sister-in-law was not going to come in and have her daughter or kids testify against their aunt.
So I guess that segues into my next question for you. Given all the time since the trials, 325 years of personal reflection through family lineage, mm-hmm. and also the city's memory, mm-hmm. of the trials, do you think that these victims finally found the justice they deserved?
Well, I don't know. Within 3 years of the trials, you have people apologizing publicly. Mm-hmm. Within 10 years, they're reversing the attainder on the ones who were actually convicted. In 20 years, the government was compensating people for their losses. So basically, they had come around. I don't know. It seemed sort of silly to me in the 1950s when people came forward and said, well, 6 of these people, nobody ever came forward to reverse the attainder on them for their convictions. So can we get that done? And there was a bill that reversed the attainder on Ann Pudater and others. And it was only when Jane Swift, acting governor of Massachusetts, came along and said, okay, we're gonna do all 5 of them by name. I know that there were people here in Salem that kept putting things forward to Massachusetts, say, can we just actually name them and reverse the attainder, and that's okay, but I thought Jane Swift doing it on Halloween was a bit much. So I don't necessarily know I don't know what we get from later generations saying this was, I don't know. So we've known it's been wrong for a long time. So there have been some of those efforts. I really like the memorials that have been made. So I don't know about, legally reversing the attainder on them is as important as coming up with places that you actually see names and you can start seeing those individuals.
Right.
The one from the tercentenary? No, am I getting it right?
Tercentenary.
Tercentenary.
Got it.
I should be able to do it. I find that a really nice spot. And when I take friends there, I go around to all the benches and I tell them a story about each person. So it's very hard during haunted happenings to see people using it as a place to just sort of hang out and sit on benches.
We'll revisit that in a minute.
Okay. But I find that a very powerful reminder and a way to see these people as individuals, because otherwise it can be a blur. And I don't like something as horrific as this to become a blur.
Right. What type of social injustices stick out to you today based off of the lessons we've learned from the 1692 trials?
Well, the power of gossip is really potent, and you have to be very careful about what people say about others. In our political situation right now, there seems to be some kind of polarization between, I don't know, I don't believe there's anything such alternative facts, because facts are facts.
Right.
I think they're facts and they're lies. And I think trying to separate truth from fiction is even more important right now. And there have been so many fictions written and repeated about the Salem witchcraft trials, so that when somebody says something, I want to know, where did that come from? And that really informs a whole lot of my political take today. Because how do we know what we know? And there's been such an attack by some people politically to try and undermine reality for their own political purposes. And that just really, it boggles my mind. I also think that the 45th President of the United States, who shall remain nameless, claiming that the biggest witch hunt is against him is just totally ridiculous. How dare he? But then again, the politicians here in Salem tweeted against that. Oh, really? Do you know your history? So I really think we need to figure out what facts are, and what we agree upon is how do we determine facts? Because then you can have interpretations. But if you mess with what you think is the truth, that really causes lots of problems. So I always want to know, what are the facts? How do you know? That's the other thing. How do we know what we know? And facts shouldn't be debatable.
Because they're facts.
Well, there are things we can agree upon, that we can look at the same sources and say, okay, this is an actual primary source of the time. This says this. Now, a primary source might lie. The person back in the 17th century could be writing something down that's a lie, but we know it's a fact that they somehow uttered this and it ended up on this particular piece of paper, written down by somebody in particular. And we can see lots of evidence to show who it was who wrote it down. We can look at, what do we know? How do we know it? Because then you can interpret things.
Right.
Then you can do an interpretation. Then you can take a political position. Then you can decide. But if you don't agree on the facts, and even the court then, they disagreed on spectral evidence. One of the things was, could the devil send the specter of an innocent person to afflict? Because the girls were claiming they were seeing the specters of people afflicting them. And they claimed that the witch was sending this image that nobody else could see toward them to bite them and pinch them and almost choke them to death.
And this was the first time spectral evidence was being used, correct?
Well, no, the idea, there was a case in Rhode Island of somebody who had passed away under strange circumstances, but they decided it was natural until a brother had a dream and her ghost came to him and said, "I've been murdered." And they reopened the case, arrested and convicted her son, and then hanged him. This is the case of Rebecca Cornell. So there were that kind of, ghostly testimony, and here the girls were claiming that the specter of people were coming and attacking them. And how did they know? Well, they recognized them. Until they didn't know these people, and then they claimed that the specter identified themselves. Oh, she said her name was Goody Martin, and she was from Amesbury. They didn't know her. But the whole idea that a specter would look like the person who was afflicting them, Dorcas Hoare, they'd come up with a name and described her, and finally when they hauled her in, they go, oh yeah, that's the one. I'm sorry. But the debate was whether the devil, being the trickster that he is, could use the image of an innocent person to do the afflicting. And, they were invoking Witch of Endor, a lot of the biblical things, so they were having these debates, but the court, and I'm going to specifically say William Stoughton, who was the chief magistrate, held that the devil had to get the permission of a person to be able to use their specter to afflict, and that made spectral evidence convictive. So, at the time they were debating, what is reality? How do we know? Of course, I'm going, but they both still assumed that the devil could send a specter to afflict people. Okay.
I want to return to a topic that you brought up a few moments ago. I want to talk about Salem a little bit now. So do you come and visit Salem for October?
Never.
No?
Never.
Do you come during the off-season?
Well, when it's not haunted happenings, I don't call it the off season, I just call it Salem. And also there's just so much kitsch and some of the stores and the museums and things like that. And of course you have the Bewitched statue. Yes. But I go see Elizabeth Montgomery's statue and I pose with it and I do, I make fun a little bit of it. I don't generally go into most of the stores unless I'm visiting people and I say, oh, I'm going to bring them like a shot glass with a witch on it, right, just because. But those aren't the places I go to. I like the Peabody Essex Museum, and I like the Phillips Library, although it's been bopping around in locations. Yes. I loved coming to it when it was right there across from the main museum. It was such a great space, and really had a sense of time and place. I mean, there are a lot of libraries and historical societies that got built around 1900, and it really had a sense of, there's a place to do your genealogy. You got a sense of time and place. So tracking it down and following it has been difficult, and that was the main reason that I would come down, and spend the day in the archives, and then finally go, oh, I didn't stop for lunch. I have to find some place to eat, and that's when I would start exploring. So I had a friend from California, one of my friends from the graduate program at USC. She came to visit, and I said, well, let's go down to Salem. And I took her into the Phillips Library because there was a document I needed to see. So she got to see me looking at the real stuff. And they were just great because I'd go in and say, I need to see this. They'd bring it out of the vault. I'd get to look at it. Because looking at the documents, you can see things that you can't from facsimiles. And then I said, okay, let's go to the other end. And I went to some place. Oh, you can probably come up with the name. I can't remember the name, but it was right there on Derby Street, and you have to go down in the basement. And it's got life-size mannequins doing the different poses. So there's Tituba sitting in a chair, telling these stories. And the guide, he was making up stuff. And, I'd be hearing what he was saying, going, oh my God, what is he doing? And the worst one, we came around the corner, and there on the right, it was sort of this dark scene with two guys with a lantern digging. And he said that Cotton Mather had sent them to dig up the body of George Burroughs, Reverend George Burroughs, so that he could boil the head down to the skull.
I've heard of this story.
Yes, so that he could try and find from the bumps on the skull what had caused this minister to go bad. And of course, on the left side, there's Cotton Mather in his wig, writing more Wonders of the Invisible World, and he's got a skull on his desk. And I'm going, okay, this is really stupid because phrenology was not there in the 17th century. And the skull on his desk was probably that of Metacom, who was known to the English as King Philip from the wars in the 1670s. And apparently when they tore him apart and his head ended up on a spike, supposedly, in Plymouth, and then eventually the skull got to Cotton Mather. But here he's inventing this whole story about Cotton Mather having these guys dig up George Burroughs. And at that point, I had to fall behind. I was laughing so hard. But of course, it's an engaging story. But that's the kind of stuff I come up against when I see some of the fabrications and the entertainment value. I had to fall behind. I was laughing so hard. The guy was so earnest about it. I'm going, really? But here he had these things, these visuals, and he had a story that made it make sense. When actually the part with the people with the lantern and digging up, that was based on the oral history that after people were hanged, they were buried in shallow graves near the gallows, and the families would come under cover of darkness to reclaim the bodies of their family members, and take them away and bury them privately.
So given these stories that we see in institutions like that one that you were just describing, in haunted happenings, if you could communicate with Rebecca Nurse, what would you want to know? What would you want to ask her?
Oh boy, that's a tough one. I would ask her a couple of questions to clarify some things.
Sure.
Because supposedly she was given a reprieve from the governor. And then some worthy gentleman apparently got back to the governor, and it got pulled. I mean, her case is just, she had all sorts of chances to try and get out. I want to know who it was that convinced the governor to go forward. Now, she was actually found not guilty.
Yeah.
And she pushed for her own innocence so much, but I want to know who that was that convinced the governor to pull his reprieve. We don't know.
What would you tell her?
I would tell her we still remember her case as being a total travesty, and that everything she did, she fought for her own innocence. I mean, she was found not guilty, and then they pushed and pushed. Well, William Stoughton. I'd tell her that we see she was innocent today. Not that it would have done her any good, but she fought valiantly for her own innocence to be proclaimed, and I'm sorry. I tell her I'm sorry it didn't work, and that I wish it had turned out differently, because if her case had turned out differently, chances are pretty good it wouldn't have turned into what was now known as the Salem witchcraft trials. It would have been just a couple of, the usual suspects, and then these two fully covenanted members of their churches, and that should have ended it. And I don't think she could have done more. She did everything she could, and things were working against her. I'd tell her that you didn't have a chance. And I think Stoughton was really going to go after as many people as possible, and she was, the fact that they actually arrested her, convicted her, hanged her, proves that they were going to do everything they could. I don't know.
I have one last question before we wrap up. The hanging sites that have been reconfirmed again, do you think this adds a new chapter in Salem's memory of the trials?
Well, it gives us another memorial, so people can go to that. I've known for a long time where it was. I mean, most experts have seen all the evidence all along. Of course, we didn't do the ground-penetrating radar. I asked why they did that. When Tad and Marilyn Roach were putting together all the evidence, and I heard there was ground-penetrating radar. Why? And Marilyn Roach said, well, that's to show people there aren't any bodies down there. Okay. But I visited that spot on Proctor's Ledge a long time ago, and it was just this ratty little lot. It was sort of like, this is where they hanged them? This is just miserable. And, I had to park my car and wander around, and so at one point I was on the show Who Do You Think You Are, talking to Scott Foley, whose ancestor Samuel Wardwell was hanged. And one of the things they like to do in that show is to show them the documents and then give them an experiential part where you get to go out and be someplace. They took some guy to Alaska. They had somebody else go to Georgia, and he's lifting up the orange clay of Georgia, and they wanted to send him someplace. They said, can we send him to, you know, the site of the hangings? I said, no. You don't want to wander around this horrible little piece of land that nobody has done anything with. And I know at that point they were already working on doing the press release about the site, and there was talk about having a memorial. It just wasn't ready for them. And that bothered me, that we couldn't take him to that. He went to the existing memorial with the benches,
Yep.
and that seemed pretty powerful, but it was just like, yeah, we need some place for people to go. And again, it gives the names again, and I think it's a quiet, contemplative place. And I think that's a good way to have a memorial.
Well, I want to thank you again for driving down from New Hampshire. I loved learning from you. You have a lot of enthusiasm for your work, and I'm sure that you're going to do more great things when you retire. You have all this free time.
Well, it won't be for a while, though. I'm retiring. Oh, yeah.
Not anytime soon.
Well, within the decade, that's when you start looking at your retirement things and what your own legacy is going to be. So,
But-
anyway, Courtney, this has just been wonderful.
Thank you again.
Yeah.